with ADHD flow, it's different than hyperfocus. So with ADHD, we can get locked on if you've had that with the hyperfocus where it's like nothing else exists, and it's all you want to do, and you might forget what time it is, or forget an appointment, or forget your flight. Has anybody experienced that before? Right? It's like not so like nothing else exists sometimes with ADHD hyper focus, and it can be the superpower because it's like we have sometimes more energy at the end than when we started, or it's just other people get tired and we're not tired anymore. And so ADHD flow is different, and it's different because and there's one difference. So what I'm going to talk to you about too is like the hyper focus, and then the flow, and how because they're very very similar, and so sometimes, right, we can have that issue where we can't focus on some things, and then it can be the extreme. And so with the hyper focus and the ADHD flow, the one difference is control. And what I mean by that is with ADHD flow, you're not forgetting to drink water, you're not forgetting to use the restroom, you're not forgetting what time it is, you're not forgetting appointments, and yet you're very productive and you're very focused and you have good energy. And if you think of it, I don't know if you ever rode a bus like when you're headed to school, and like there's different bus stops. And so the way to think about this is like the first bus stop is we're not really focusing. The next one is we're kind of focusing, we're interested, the next one a little bit more. And the next one is going to be that ADHD flow. And then the next stop on that path is the hyper focus. So the ADHD flow is before you get to the hyper focus, and yet it still mimics a lot of the characteristics. And so you're not going to forget to what time it is. You're not going to forget to eat or drink water, and you're not going to completely lose yourself. And the benefit to ADHD flow over hyperfocus, and I'll talk about, there's certain situations where you're going to want the hyperfocus and certain ones where you're going to want the flow. The benefit to the flow is when I was doing the research on this, with ADHD hyperfocus, you can get to a certain threshold where now you're depleting your blood glucose levels. Have you ever had a day of or a time of complete hyperfocus and then you felt almost sick after, or you felt less well, or you felt really fatigued or exhausted, or something like that, or maybe you had to really recover the next day? And so the ADHD flow, the goal for that is you have more control. And that's what and I was studying some researchers and psychologists from other countries, because again, it wasn't as common. And so I don't even know if I can say this person's name, but it was a psychologist, and their name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. So I'll put this in the notes. And so I may have butchered that a little bit. And this is a really wonderful psychologist on there. And so they talk about the flow state. It's really having control. Now, there are some situations where you're going to want hyperfocus, and I'll talk about that a little bit here, of like when to use hyperfocus and when to use flow. But there is a time in between before you get to exhaustion, dehydration, burnout, sleep patterns, those kinds of stuff. So one thing with like kind of getting yourself in that flow versus the hyper focus is having breaks in there. And we're going to breaks just a little bit different. And so when we have breaks in there, the key thing on this is, remember, we can be at a deficit sometimes of dopamine, is when you take a break and you want to, because there's a certain threshold, if you ever had that, like you don't get into hyper focus right away, right? It's like you're in it for a little bit and then you get into hyper focus. And so you want to gauge how long that takes you and kind of have, again, more self-awareness around when you're about to move into that hyper focus, if you don't want it for that situation. And then you're going to want to put breaks in place. So it might be every 30 minutes, it might be every hour, it might be, if you're working on something, whatever that looks like for you, where you're stopping it before it goes straight into that hyper focus. And then here's the key thing on the break that you take. Remember, we have a deficit of dopamine. So when you take a break, do not do an activity that is going to create more dopamine than the thing you're doing. So for example, has anybody been afraid to stop because you don't think you're going to be able to start again? Have you ever had that? It's like, well, I don't want to start because like I don't know when I'm going to go back to this. Okay. So this is really important because remember, we're at the deficit of dopamine. So if you take a break and you go to your phone, there's more dopamine there, most likely. If you take a break and you've got something going on that's urgent, remember INCUP, interesting, new, challenging, urgent, passion. These are 5 things that create dopamine. And so if you want to go back to that thing that you've been doing, be aware of on your break doing something that's really interesting to you, that's new, if it's challenging, if it's urgent, if it's a passion. And so you might, sit outside in nature instead of do something. Don't look at a screen. You might read a book that's kind of interesting, but you're not going to get engaged in it. You might go drink water, some tea, something, but be wary because again, it's like because we can have less dopamine for some of us that like we're gonna just, it's like our brain overrides. It's like, no, we're starving for dopamine. We're not going back to that thing. So that's one thing that's really, really key. If you're scared you're not going to go back to it, be wary of how you're spending your break. I don't think a lot of people talk about that. And then make it easy to come back to it. That's a big one. And then also giving yourself time limits for the whole project. So you might have time limits and then breaks in between. And then let's see. Okay, so yeah, we watched that. And so with ADHD flow, the other thing we want to think about is with hyper focus, we can sometimes forget the world exists. Nothing can pull us off of that. Well, if we're not in that hyper focus zone, we can be a little bit more privy to be distracted by things. And so you're going to want to watch the distractions even more so. So if I have something that I want to spend time on and I don't want to go into hyper focus, maybe I have something later that day, or I just don't want to do that. If we have something, what we're going to do is have a certain amount of time that we dedicate to it. Then I'm going to have those breaks in between. And then I'm going to probably put my phone somewhere else. Put it on silent, put it somewhere else. If you want your phone around you, maybe put it on airplane mode, because there is that temptation to check it. And if there's something urgent, which in real estate, there's usually something urgent, now we're creating more dopamine. And sometimes it's just subconscious that we go to that next thing. And so when we want to create an environment for that ADHD flow, where we're getting rid of as many distractions as we can, and really giving ourselves the best opportunity, make sure distractions can also be sensory stuff. Make sure that you've got water right there for you. Make sure that you've eaten, you don't have low blood sugar. We're kind of just, it's like when you think of it, when you are sending a kid to school, right? If you have a kid, if you've been a kid at one point, if you have a niece or nephew, right? We all that, like, think of setting that kid up where it's okay. Hey, the distractions are gone. We packed your lunch. You've ate a good breakfast. You've got water. And now you're ready for the day. You're in clean clothes. So we want to eliminate any kind of sensory distractions as well. And the other thing we want to do is have time limits. And then I'm going to go back to what the researcher said. We want to have like benchmarks, like really clear goals of what's expected. So for example, if I gave you a list of things to do, and I said, here's exactly what needs to happen, here's the exact order, you're probably going to do pretty well with that. But if I say, okay, like let's say I needed your help like cleaning out an office or something. And I said, okay, here's the list. First, we want to pick up the trash. And then second, we want to grab all the files in one place. And then the next thing we want to do is like clean off the desk, make sure there's no coffee spilled, that kind of stuff. But if I just said, okay, here's my office, go ahead and clean it, like help me clean, we're going to struggle even more so than somebody else, just because sometimes we have like that trouble kind of prioritizing and organizing and stuff like that. And so you really want to set yourself up well and have a list of like, okay, here's what I'm gonna do first, here's what I'm gonna do next, here's what I'm gonna do next. Turn off the distractions. I think somebody in the comments put set an alarm. Absolutely, absolutely. So set an alarm to know when you're done, and then keep your break, some people an hour, some people maybe 30 minutes. You might want a little bit more than 30 depending on what you're doing, just depends. And so we want to really set ourselves up well and also not have it creep into that kind of extreme hyper focus for this if you want to do ADHD flow, like again, I'm going to talk about in a second why we might want to do both. The other thing is immediate feedback. And so when you have a list that you can check the box off, that does create dopamine. It feels good. And so having something where there's some kind of feedback consistently that you did something is really helpful. So that's why checklists can be can be a good thing. She also talks about, and this can also be called like in the zone, right? You might see these with athletes sometimes, or just in certain different demographics. And so she says also that we want the task to be difficult enough to be engaging, but not so challenging that it's frustrating, because then we can run into some emotion regulation stuff. It can be a little bit harder. And and then also you can tell someone. So if you know you have a tendency to go into hyper focus on something, letting somebody know that and just checking on you is helpful. Like for example, I was staying with my aunt and uncle, and I sometimes can be on my phone a little bit too long. And so I gave them permission to remind me what time it was, and I was going to put my phone away. So there's body doubling, right? People are watching. And so that way it kind of stopped me from getting too into it in that sense. Clear goals is going to be really helpful. If you do it the night before, I've got a lot of coaching clients that do really well kind of coming up with the list the night before versus like the day of. So that can be really helpful. And then you may have a break for eating like a snack or going for a walk or something like that. And then also having a reward after your ADHD flow, like after you're done with it, can be really helpful as well, and just something to do that. So then the question is, okay, what are the situations where we might want to hyperfixate, and what are the situations where we might want ADHD flow? Because hyperfixation that we have, or hyperfocus, can be really awesome. There's a lot of benefits to that, and so it's not like that's a bad thing. This is just to kind of harness it, because I just haven't seen anybody really talk about it this much, really that much. So a situation where, let's first talk about the hyper focus. So like I'll say for me personally, a situation where I would want a hyper focus is if I'm writing a speech, if it's something I want to get really creative and just forget the world exists. If I'm writing content, if I'm doing something where let's say the consequences in a sense of forgetting to drink water for a little bit or forgetting to eat are worth it. So if I have a deadline that I need to just lock into, we have this ability that a lot of other people don't have. This is a secret weapon. And so this calls a little bit more about harnessing it versus it being a default and having a little bit more control. So the hyper focus is, you have this happened to me. I mean, this was when I spoke at Femme Reunion in Turkey during the Syrian suicide bombings, and they wanted a keynote that was going to be inspiring. And I talked to the founder, and he was like, it's in 2 weeks. And instead of a panelist, we want you to speak. Can you do this? Yeah. So hyper focus, let's turn it on. And a lot of things suffered those 2 weeks, but I was really happy with how it went, and it was totally worth it. It was totally worth it, and other people would think, oh my gosh, why am I staying up every night? Why don't you get tired of this? Like, this is too much. And yet on the outside, if you don't have hyper focus, it looks like too much, or they wouldn't be able to do it. Whereas on the inside, we could, so if you want to meet a deadline, if the trade-off is worth it for you. Another thing, and I know I'm not alone in this, like negative thinking patterns, or just kind of spiraling a little bit. I mean, I think a lot of you guys know I have OCD as well. And so when I've got kind of a pattern of intrusive thoughts or something that doesn't feel good, and I'm just stuck in it for a couple of days. Have you ever had that? It's kind of like there's like this radio station playing in the back of your mind that doesn't feel good, and it's just been playing for a couple of days, and you're like, oh my gosh, how am I not getting out of this? What's wrong with it? So I use my hyperfocus as a pattern interrupt, because we can get so engrossed in things and so locked in. What it does is it stops that spiral. And so I will use, like, sometimes shows, like binge watching shows, video games, books can sometimes do it, certain activities, like hobbies, those things. So I might actually schedule that and do it intentionally, because it's going to completely do a pattern interrupt of it's almost like for sometimes for me it's like there's something like an intrusive thought, or kind of negative thinking, that's automatic, and it's a snowball rolling down a hill and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, if I can stop that and lock into something for a little bit that's fun and enjoyable, and creates dopamine, because we talked about on one of the calls how sometimes our thoughts that don't feel good create cortisol and endorphins and dopamine. So we can almost get addicted sometimes, or just subconsciously drawn to thoughts that are kind of extreme because they create dopamine. And so I will intentionally use a hyper focus and get locked into something as a pattern interrupt. So that can be really helpful. If you're creative, there's a lot of different ways to use that hyper focus. There's really not anything about ADHD and real estate out there that I found. We're kind of doing it. You guys are doing it by voting on the topic, so we're kind of creating it. And so it was a little bit harder to find real estate specific examples. So if you have any, write those down. So that hyper focus we can use on a lot of different things: projects, creativity, pattern interrupts, deadlines, lots of really great things. And then the flow is really helpful when we have consistent tasks that maybe don't have a deadline, and yet we want to be productive. We want to get that done. We might have something later in the day that we don't want to forget the world exists, or an appointment. You also, like I said, with hyper focus, if you go past a certain point, what the research shows is that can deplete your blood glucose level. And so if that's you, you may intentionally not go into hyper focus that day if your immune system feels a little bit weaker that day, or if you feel tired or maybe not totally well, or you just don't want to do it, that you want to get so into something because you're just not in that place. And so you can choose then when to use it or when to not use it. And or if there's something that is going to lock you in where you just aren't going to want to do anything else that day, but you need to, something you don't want to do that's not as dopamine producing, then you might not go into hyper focus, something like that. So again, it's think of it like you're on the bus, right? And it's the stop right before hyper focus. That's what ADHD flow is. It's right before you get to hyper focus. You're still productive. You still got energy. It's still feeling good, but you're just not crossing the barrier where you forget, the world exists. Let's say it's one more thing. And so if you're leading somebody, not only yourself, let's say you're leading somebody with ADHD, or you're a parent and have kids with ADHD, or a spouse, because again, there's a 50% chance your kids have ADHD if you have it, or your parents, 50% chance your parents have it if you have it. And so or just your coworkers, right? And we're learning that there's a very high prevalence of ADHD in real estate agents. And so this is something that you can kind of help and encourage, and encourage breaks, and encourage that spot before burnout or feeling too tired, and advocate for more breaks. If you're in a training and it's all day training, take breaks that you need, even if they don't give them. I mean, take them anyways, and allow yourself to be flexible with yourself, and have that self-awareness. So that is the ADHD flow. Like I said, just to recap, set time limits, tell someone you need to take a break, be really wary on your breaks that you're not doing something that produces more dopamine, because it's going to be harder to go back to. Get a fun activity after, some kind of reward potentially. Set clear goals of what you need to do, so you're not just walking into, because ADHD flow, we're also not going to get into it if we walk into a room and there's no direction and we don't know what we're supposed to be doing, and then that's where we can get ADHD paralysis and shut down, or we're not sure what the next step is. And then when you get ADHD paralysis, sometimes like I will go to something to distract me because I'm trying to regulate my nervous system or my mood because I got overwhelmed. And so we can eliminate all that by having a clear plan of what you want to do. You also can do this on a consistent basis. So it might be that you block in certain tasks to do with breaks during your day. You might have a 2-hour time slot where it's like your ADHD flow, and it's to knock out these tasks that maybe aren't this one engrossing thing, but it's stuff you want to get done. So that is ADHD Flow. Next week, Tuesday call is going to be a kids call. So this is going to be for kids about 4 to 12 years old. I'll do one for like a teenager call too. So I'm going to do a call for kids. So if you have kids, nephews, nieces, your inner child, even if you don't have a kid, like sometimes it's kind of cool to like let the kid part of you listen. And we're going to be talking about, it's going to be geared towards kids, and any kids can be on it, and just talking about stuff you can do at school, if adults don't listen to you, how to handle that, and adaptations. Yeah, so next Tuesday is the kids call, and then again we'll do one for teenagers, so that'll be like 13 to 18, like young adults. So it's going to be really cool. So yeah, like if you don't have a kid, be on it. Like sometimes it's really healing for your inner child to be on there too. You know what I mean? Appreciate you guys. See you next week for the kids call. Thanks for being here, and get into that ADHD flow. All right.